I'm going to demonstrate how to make short crust pastry. So I've started off, I've got 200 grams of plain flour and I'm just adding in a pinch of salt, and the salt is just going to give some flavour to it. Okay, into the plain flour I'm going to use a combination of butter and white fat. So this is just Trex. It's an alternative to lard, which is an animal fat. So this is lower in saturated fat, and obviously our butter is there because it is going to give a flavour and colour, but the white fat is there because it will make it a bit more crumbly and shortens better. So it's got better properties for shortening. So to start with, I'm just going to use my knife and I'm just going to cut it into small bits into the flour. So we're using plain flour because it's got a low gluten content. So we don't want chewy pastry. We want a nice, soft, crumbly pastry. Obviously, self-raising flour has raising agent in it, so we don't use that. So we're using plain flour as opposed to strong flour or bread flour. And we're just cutting in our fat into our flour because this is the process of shortening. So shortening is where we rub in our fat to our flour, and what happens is the fat gives each of the starch grains a nice waterproof protective coating, so that actually it prevents it from absorbing too much liquid and creating gluten. So when we actually finish off with our pastry, we end up with a crumbly texture because it's got lots of shorter fibres into it rather than long structures of gluten, which we would have in bread. So we're just using our fingertips and you are just rubbing the fat into the flour. Short crust pastry, the ratio is half the amount of fat to flour. So if you needed to make more or less pastry, you could increase the amount of flour and use half the amount of fat to it. You could use all butter, you could use all white fat. It's entirely up to you in terms of your preferences of taste and texture. So you can see that I'm moving it around and I'm getting to the bottom of the bowl as well to make sure that we're getting all of that flour, and you're getting a more crumbly breadcrumb-like texture. It's looking a bit sandy. Once you get to the stage where you feel that you've got big chunks that you can't necessarily get rid of, just rub it between your two hands so that it's nice and light and crumbly. If you just give your bowl a shake and a bit of a tap, any big lumps will come to the top. Okay, once you're satisfied that it's all rubbed in, you are going to add your water to your mixture. And for 200 grams of flour, I am going to add 8 teaspoons of water. So it's 1 teaspoon for every 25 grams. Now, I'm using cold water because we need to keep our ingredients as cold as possible. Okay, and the reason why we need to keep our ingredients as cold as possible is so that the fat doesn't melt, because if it starts to melt it will make it greasy, which is why we only use our fingertips. If you do feel that you have got hot hands, run your wrists underneath the cold water tap and that should cool down your hands a little bit. If you still struggle with the fact that you've got hot hands and you just end up with greasy pastry, use a food processor. Okay, so bring it together and you can see that it's actually coming together into clumps. It isn't going to stick together at this point. What you need to do is you need to squeeze it together into a ball. And that should all come together and leave you with a clean bowl. You don't want to handle it too much because, again, we don't want to get that greasy pastry. We're not developing the gluten. We don't want to knead it. We just want to bring it together. And now, before we roll it out, we are just going to allow it to rest for about 10 to 15 minutes. So you should have a ball of pastry that comes together. So now I'm going to show you how to put a pastry lid on top of a pie dish. Okay, so I've got some chicken leek and asparagus filling there with a velouté sauce ready to be topped with our pastry lid. So when I'm rolling out pastry, I just wipe my surface with a damp cloth and then just sprinkle over some more plain flour to prevent my pastry from sticking to my worktop. Okay, so just moulding it with your hands, so it's just been resting in the fridge to relax it, and then another bit of flour over your rolling pin, and then with short crust pastry you're going to do one roll turn, and it is going to look like it's going to crack, but you just need to keep on bringing it together. So you can see that I've curved my hand from the top and I'm pushing it down and out from the top. So it's really important that you handle short crust pastry as little as possible, or pastry as little as possible, and you need to try and keep it cool. So you're going to do one roll and turn. So one roll, turn. This is looking like it's going to crack a little bit, so I'm just going to bring it back in together, and the warmth of my hands will just soften it and bring it together. It's just getting the fat to work. So carefully bring it round. You need to try and reduce the possibility of you bringing it back together and re-rolling it as much as possible. So try and keep it together as much as you can whilst you're doing it. Now we're looking for a thickness of about £1 coin, okay? So that the pastry's got something to stick on around the dish, we are just going to put a little rim of pastry around our dish. So I'm just cutting some thin strips and then just getting some water and running some water around the top edge of your pie dish, and then you are just going to mould the pastry around the top. This obviously doesn't need to be quite the same thickness, it's just so that the pastry lid has got something to hold on to while it's going on your dish. Just need a small bit. And the water just helps it to stick. So we're then looking at getting a piece of pastry that's big enough to go onto the top of the dish. To make it so that our pastry is going to stick, I'm just going to run a small amount of water around the top of our pastry on our dish, and then I'm just going to fold this in half gently and cut in some steam holes. So just a couple of steam holes in the top of our pastry, trying to get it as much in the centre as possible. And then you're going to lay your pastry onto the top, and because we've put some water on there, it should stick to it. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you're going to get your knife and on an angle, so you're picking up your dish and on an angle you're just going to trim around so that we get a nice neat finish to our pie dish. And to make it so that it's sealed together, you can always use your fork to finish off, or there are many other ways that you can crimp the edges. To finish your pie and give it so it's got a nice glaze on it, I have just whisked up an egg, and then I'm just brushing some egg on the top. If you haven't got any eggs, you can always use milk, which would also glaze your pie. It would just give it more of a matte finish. The egg will give it a nice shiny finish. But please do remember to put some steam holes into the top of your pie to allow any steam to escape and prevent you from getting pastry which is too soggy on the top. Once your pie is then ready, that needs to go in the oven on gas mark 6 for about 20 to 25 minutes until it's nice and golden brown. So gas mark 6 or 200 degrees C.